Good morning, everyone, and welcome once again to the Friday JKMRC Seminar series. On behalf of the University of Queensland and the Sustainable Minerals Institute, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections with country, and we recognize the valuable contribution to Australia and the global society. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Paul Greenhill. So Paul is a principal consultant in the geometallurgy group of AMC Consultants and provides metallurgical expertise across AMC's businesses. Paul's career has included postdoctoral research at the University of Edinburgh, senior research scientist at Comalco Limited on advanced aluminium smelting technologies and technical support, 13 years with AMIRA International, including chief operating officer and research director. Subsequently, Paul took over managing director of RMDStem Limited, a mining technology consultancy. He worked independently as a consultant in minerals and technology before joining AMC in 2018. Paul is a PhD-trained physical and theoretical chemist, and today Paul is going to talk about using machine learning tools and multivariate analysis for metallurgical sample selection and predictive geometallurgy. Please join me in welcoming Paul. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you to the JKMRC for the invitation to make this presentation. Of course, as a number of you will be aware, I've had a long association with the JKMRC, particularly through AMIRA, and it is indeed a pleasure to be able to give something back. So what I'm going to cover today in a fairly limited manner is the way AMC is using various machine learning tools and particularly multivariate analysis to support or to develop ultimately predictive geometallurgical models. So the first thing I want to do, of course, is acknowledge the team that's behind this. Ian Lipton is a geologist and was in fact the initiator of this service within AMC several years ago. Other people were involved at the time as well. We've since left, but Ian is owed a significant plaudit for having the foresight to establish this service. Lewis Torres is a senior data scientist. Lewis is a PhD astrophysicist with a very strong mathematical background, and he provides much of the underlying maths and modelling capability that we use. Melissa Gregory, principal geometallurgist. Melissa is a geologist and a mineralogist, and her skills in the interpretation of mineralogy and geochemical data within this service is an extremely important contribution to what we do. Kathy Zuniga, senior geologist, provides geological support and background to the service. And Tracy Burrows, senior principal geologist at AMC, is the lead of the group, and similarly Tracy provides geological support and insight to the whole thing. As well as that, obviously being part of AMC and it being a mining consultancy, you've got access to about 100 mining engineers who can fill in a few of the mining-related opportunities that geometallurgy actually brings. I think it's important to note that when we talk about geometallurgy and we try to develop the service and understanding that it's extremely important to have all of the capability together. So the one thing that this group does have is it has representation from all of the technical areas. that are important. And that's important from the perspective of generating, outputs that are usable for our clients, but also a shared understanding across all of the disciplines that goes into this space. So let me just let me kick off. So the selection of metallurgical samples is often characterised by quite subjective or semi-quantitative and occasionally, fortunately, quantitative criteria. However, that's less common than you would believe. So in general, of course, too few samples are subject to the test work to properly describe the behaviour of the ore. And we see that time and time again when we see very small sample sets used to try to describe comminution behaviour of enormous deposits. So the ultimate result in all of that is really high uncertainty in the metallurgical response, and really that contributes an increased risk too for studies in those designs and in the economic evaluations. But of course, there is a wealth of data in the geological database that can be utilised to both characterise the ore body and to assist in the selection of samples for testing. And it is that wealth of data which is critically important in our belief for any really effective geometallurgical development. The real question, of course, is actually how do you use it? So what is it actually all about? So it's really important to understand that what we want to do is go back to the ore body. So it's really about generating usable 3D predictive models of metallurgical performance that inform studies and operational decisions. In any scenario, the objective is to reduce the uncertainty and thereby reduce the risk. That is the nature of studies. That is why you do them. And ultimately, that allows us to make better and more informed decisions. And all of this is facilitated by increasing our ore body knowledge. So the geological database is usually a data-rich environment. And for example, it can contain geochemical assays, mineralogical measurements, physical measurements, and visual logging. In contrast, as metallurgists, our metallurgical database is usually very data poor. We're always constrained by costs, we're always constrained by timeframes, and there is a strong focus on process designs to treat some life of mine average description of the ore body. So ultimately, only a minute fraction of the ore body will actually be tested. So that gives a large scope for emission of absolutely critical samples that really will influence or could influence process performance. So the objective in all of this work is to expand the metallurgical characteristics of the ore body by leveraging the large geology data set. So how can we actually do that? So within the service we offer and what we do, we describe the process in the following way. So the key is the ability to use data science methods to describe the multivariate properties of the ore body using the properties that are known for both the geological samples and the metallurgical samples. For example, these will include elemental assays, the geological interpretation, the measured or observed lithologies and alterations, measured mineral compositions, if they happen to have been done or they exist in whatever form. But data science methods actually allow us to take the multidimensional geological data and describe those relationships between the multiple variables. And using appropriate tools, those relationships can all be visualized in 2 dimensions. And I will expand on this a little later on. So once we've described the multivariate characteristics, we can select metallurgical samples that span the types of ore available by using this 2D projection. So we run tests, and the results are used to build predictive models based on the available parameters in the drill hole database or in the block model. We can then predict the metallurgical properties across the 3D model. So I want to examine the key process in some more detail. First, a couple of comments on samples. I'll make a couple of brief comments, but I won't dwell on it. It's extremely important to select the correct type of sample. Absolutely critical to the ultimate objective here. So those samples should have a unique set of characteristics, and typically when we're doing studies, we would call these variability samples. But variability samples come in all sorts, in a number of variations, and sometimes they're not actually true variability samples. Composites do creep into that class at times, and so on. So these individual samples should have a unique set of characteristics that are local properties to the sample in question. That sample set actually needs to have all relevant characteristics and the ranges of property values. So simple examples, of course, grade variation needs to be covered. For comminution prediction, we need to understand the range of hardness and so on, etc. When it comes to predictive modelling, then composites and blends are actually not suitable for that because they do not isolate the unique characteristics of any sample. A composite obviously merges characteristics of multiple samples, and it also generally narrows the range of the individual properties within those samples. So when we get around to selecting samples for logical reasons, continuous intercepts from single drill holes are the preferred sample type. And of course, uncrushed drill core enables all types of metallurgical testing. There are many, many instances where we are given samples that have already been pre-treated, whether they are coarse rejects from the initial core logging process and work that is done on the core, as example, or some other pre-processing method. So ultimately, contiguous whole core or uncrushed core is the most versatile for us, and if we can grab that, then that gets us a long way down the pathway of having the right sort of samples. So I want to go on and talk a little bit about representativity, and in the context here, we're talking about the representativity of a data set. So assessing representativity is really challenging. There are diverse data types available to us or that have been measured, particularly on the geological database, including elemental assay, mineral content, whether that's quantitative and semi-quantitative, hyperspectral analysis, XRD analysis, all forms of mineral analysis can determine mineral content. We can also use physical tests like rebound hardness on drill core. These, on occasion, can be used as proxies for hardness, but they are part of the ore body knowledge that we're trying to capture. And of course, there is the geological logging that goes on, the visual logging of core, the visual identification of minerals, lithologies and types, etc. But what these form is, of course, a multivariate space that is challenging to assess and use to identify the representative samples that we want to use in testing. So traditional tools which will generally operate in 1, 2, or 3 dimensional space, because that's the way a human can see things. We can't see 4 dimensions, or 5, or 6, or 10. So that is problematic when it comes to accessing all of the variables that are potentially available to do this type of work. The 1, 2, or 3 dimensional representation simply cannot represent all of the interrelationships in such a space. The approach really isn't efficient, and it really has poor repeatability. So what is the approach that we can deploy to find the required set of samples? You know, which parts of the ore body have similar characteristics in this multivariate space? And I would make the point that what we're talking about here when we do the multivariate analysis, we are not talking about a geospatial distribution. Although we do expect different volumes of the ore body to have characteristics that are locally similar. So fortunately, there are some tools and methods that have been developed within the space by data scientists that have the mathematical capability to answer the question. So the machine learning tools provide this method, and they can handle the complex data sets and the relationships. It's important to understand that they make no a priori assumptions, and so they're not affected by the general biases that cause us to focus on certain factors to the exclusion of others. What we actually believe to be true because of our past experiences and processes loses any influence when data is analysed by these tools. So in that way, we can develop a neutral representation of the data and relationships that can be exploited. Now, having said that, that does not denigrate or reduce the knowledge that is held by subject matter experts, their experience and expertise. That is a very important component of what we do, and it sits alongside this type of analysis. But the importance about this analysis is that it is not subjective. So what do? We use 2 key methods to describe the data for the purposes of ensuring the representativity of the sample selection. So we use a dimension reduction that reduces the high dimensional data to 2 dimensions. That allows us to visualize what this multivariate space actually looks like. And we can also use mathematical grouping methods to identify the groups within the reduced space that have similar characteristics. So our preferred tools in this space are a uniform manifold approximation and projection, a UMAP, and a k-means grouping. These 2 tools allow us to both visualize that multivariate space on those multivariate relationships, but also then to group them into materials that actually are expected to respond similarly depending on the circumstance. So let's have a look at an example. So this is an example from a porphyry copper project. So the geological database that was used, once it was curated into the useful portion of that database, and bear in mind the original geological database has much more data in it. Of course, much of it is outside the mineable resource and so on. So we select from that the relevant volume of the ore body that is actually important. So in this case, there were nearly 29,000 samples, each of them typically 2 meters in length, that were then assayed for multi-elemental composition using ICP OES. We had alteration types as part of the package, sulfide mineral speciation, and on all of this core from this particular project, and it's way in excess of 100,000 meters of drill core, also had this this physical test rebound hardness measured on all of the core. So this this projection is generated by a UMAP transformation, and we've overlain by a k-means grouping analysis, where in this case k equals 7. We can actually set that number of groups to any value, and the algorithm will develop groups to accommodate the desired dimensions. Now we can see from this that there are 3 main groups that that k-means has identified: the small area to the top of the diagram, the small island in the middle, and the large horseshoe-shaped area here. With this, because we have all of the additional data within the geological database, all of the other assays from multi-element ICP, the alteration types for all of these records, etc., we can actually plot any of the other characteristics of the samples in this space. And that gives guidance and to the subject matter expert in the selection of the number of groups. We can also, of course, just manually choose groups, which is another approach to the process. The k-means algorithm is relatively efficient in doing that, but we don't ever use it in isolation. It needs to be looked at in comparison with input and expertise from the particular subject matter expertise. Now, this UMAP, the UMAP algorithm takes a number of variables from the source data and makes the computation. We can choose which variables go into this, and in this case, the number of parameters that went into this UMAP was 7. So let's have a look at an example of where we've then used the additional data within the database to and overlaid that on the UMAP. So this is a visual assessment of the distribution of some of those other variables. In this case, it's the sulfide mineral grades that have been plotted against the UMAP coordinates. So what we can see is the UMAP itself clearly separates samples with different sulfide species. And the hot colours are high grades in this instance, and you can see that the bornite sulfide, copper sulfide species is isolated to this small island in the middle. Chalcopyrite exists in this region at the bottom corner of the horseshoe, and there is the only place where chalcocite appears within this UMAP projection is in this tiny island up to the top. So this is also informative when it comes to establishing the groupings, and you can see here that it has enabled us to isolate, bornite-rich from pyrite-rich from chalcopyrite-rich regions within this grouping. When we look at around the other parts of the UMAP, there are other minerals and elements which which dominate or are important in these regions. So how do we use this, and what can we get out of it? So the dimension reduction plot enables us to visually represent where metallurgical samples exist within the multivariate space. Because the metallurgical samples themselves have the same characteristics, the same measured data as we have used to generate the UMAP, we can plot those samples on the UMAP projection. And what you can see here, where we have plotted, there are two selections, selection 1 and selection 2, metallurgical sample sets, and you can see that they actually broadly cover the UMAP space. And as we've seen previously with the sulfide projection, we could also plot, for example, if this is a porphyry, we could plot copper, we could plot gold, we could plot iron. And that allows us to determine whether or not we've actually got reasonable coverage for those elements within this metallurgical selection set. The other thing that we've represented on this diagram is areas where there are, in fact, sparse selection. And that gives us an opportunity to, in fact, add additional metallurgical samples to the group to try to cover those areas where there is limited representation. Now, the actual inclusion or of these samples is again a decision that is influenced by the subject matter expert. Some areas may be barren and there is little value in doing so. However, what this tool gives us is the opportunity to actually make that decision. So here's a further example where we've used the UMAP to identify geometallurgical groupings in the deposit that have really only been sparsely sampled for metallurgical testing, if at all. So in this instance, we can see that there are 7 geometallurgical groupings represented by the different colours, and you can see the metallurgical samples plotted in a large red maroon circles, or red pink circles. But you can also see that there are significant areas within this projection where there are no samples being selected. And interestingly enough, you can see that there are circumstances where, for whatever reason, within this projection, there is a single isolated sample that has been selected. So what that allows us to do is suggest where we might add additional samples. And on this, we have added recommended samples to the metallurgical sample set. And the objective here in this case, in the absence of other information, was to ensure that we had a reasonable coverage of the variability of the deposit as it's interpreted using this sort of multivariate analysis. Now, as I've said before, because the data includes all the characteristics of samples, we can select any of these to plot on the UMAP. And what we've got here is the elemental grade mapping for another deposit, for copper and for gold. And again, hot colours represent high grades. So this allows us to work out specifically in this instance whether we in fact sufficiently covered the grade variation for copper or gold with respect to metallurgical testing. And you can see when we look at the UMAP on the bottom right, where we've projected the metallurgical samples or plotted the metallurgical samples as the black dots, and I hope you can see them, they're relatively small. You can see, in fact, that there is quite a discrepancy between where those samples have been selected and where there are other significant copper grades that should be tested in the metallurgical program. So again, the tool allows us to make suggestions, select additional samples. And here what we've shown is suggested additional samples in the square symbols that allows us to expand the metallurgical data set. And we've also, because of course we have the spatial information about all the drill holes and all the samples, we can also plot them in real space. And on the right is a projection of the drill hole, of the drill holes through the deposit, and we can see where the original samples have come from, a concentration on this drill hole, for example, originally, and then the way in which we've added additional samples across other drill holes. I suppose one of the other things that this points out is that while intrinsically a sample selection, because of the nature of the performance of the ore, it isn't particularly necessary to have a broad spatial coverage, though that is an argument that many people will put. And it is not an irrational argument, but you can also see by approaching it this way, we can in fact do that if that is a requirement. And what this selection has actually done is in fact broadened in a spatial sense the areas from which samples have been selected. One of the things that we've also done with this selection is added additional samples within this green zone. This is broadly barren of copper and gold mineralisation. This is a calcilicate mineralised region, but it is important, in fact, to have a number of samples within for the purpose of building a predictive geometallurgical model that deal with the extremes, the end members, and so on. For that, we would recommend and always include, where possible, samples of waste or similar. This gives us a way of, in fact, choosing those as well. So let's give a flavour of the way in which we can use the multivariate analysis to generate an appropriate sample set for metallurgical testing. Now, the other question that we're always asked as metallurgists is, okay, how many samples do you actually need? Well, and in many instances, the common response is, well, more. But the question really is, how many more? And there are logically, there is an expectation that there will be limits to what that number should be. So what we have been able to do is to devise an approach to understanding what that might be, and it relies on the building of a predictive model. So this question of how many samples is fundamentally based in the desire to reduce risk. So how do we go about that? And importantly, we also want it to be a quantitative measure of risk. After all, we're dealing with a set of quantitative data to start with. So we can do that, as I said, by looking at the predictive geometallurgical models that are used to predict the processing performance based on those ore property inputs, for example, grades. So the example here, there are two predictive models. Both are machine learning models. One is based on multiple linear regression, and the other one is based on a cubist model. The cubist model is more complicated. It is, if you like, a hierarchical regression model. And we find that this type of model performs quite well in most of our geometallurgical applications. Specifically for this is a model of drop weight index. So it's important to see here that within the two models, the cubist regression model has a reduced uncertainty when compared with the linear one. We can see the standard error for the linear regression model is about 1.9, and that for the cubist regression model is about 0.9. So, but how do we use this model to assess how many samples are needed? This data set, although not an unreasonable size in most of our experience, is really too small to demonstrate that the limit of metallurgical testing has been reached, or perhaps has not been reached. So generating a sufficiently large data set for testing can be done if we can preserve the properties of the real data set. So we're going to use a tool called a probabilistic graphical model to do this. And that's a tool that will generate an expanded set of data with the same multivariate statistical properties as the original. The figure is a cumulative distribution plot showing a comparison between the original small data set and the enlarged data set. And when we're using this tool, it's very important that this CDF functions overlap as closely as possible. That indicates to us that we have a reasonable expansion of the data set with a consistent set of properties. So this is the way that we can expand the data set. In this case, we've expanded it to 10,000 members. So the aim of this approach and the way it goes about is to measure the errors in the predictions as the number of samples and test results increases. So this is an iterative process and allows us to identify the point at which the additional further data actually doesn't improve the model, or doesn't significantly improve the model. So in this particular instance, we've chosen an RMSE, root mean square error statistic to assess the model development. The figure shows the model errors plotted against the number of samples input to the model. And this shows the RMSE for both the linear regression and the cubist models, with sample numbers ranging from 1 to 500. When I say sample numbers, that's the number of samples included within the training of the predictive model. So what we see is both models very rapidly improve before their performance stabilizes. The transition is especially sharp for the linear regression model, where the RMSE stabilizes at approximately 2.3, and there is no significant improvement for more when we include more than 100 samples in the predictive model training. The cubist model clearly outperforms the linear regression model and does continue to improve beyond 100 samples. And asymptotically, it approaches an RMSE of approximately 1.4. So we can use this sort of information to determine a threshold at which either the error of the predictive model is sufficiently low as to be fit for purpose, and that's an important concept, or further testing will not significantly improve the predictions. So when I talk about fit for purpose, the objective here is to reduce the risk associated with this type of prediction approach or prediction of the metallurgical properties. And that risk is obviously associated when we think about studies to, in fact, the stage of the study. So this gives us a mechanism to to align both the study level risk that is desired as a target and how far we need to go with respect to the volume of testing that is important with respect to using a predictive geometallurgical model to assess the processing performance. So such a threshold, the thresholds at which we don't want to take more samples is data driven, and it's really not reliant upon the rules of thumb or any a priori assumptions. Now, it is important to note the threshold does change depending on the processing response that's been predicted, the modelling algorithms that are being used for the predictive model, and the number of variables features that are used by the model. Don't go into that in any detail within this presentation, but that clearly factors that impact. So in a second example, this is a set of recovery data using the same two predictive model algorithms, a linear regression and a cubist model. And we've again plotted the same values from the error estimation against the number of samples used to train the model. So you can see again, and this is a recovery prediction. The previous data was a prediction of a hardness parameter, drop weight index. You can see that it has the similar characteristics. There's a clear reduction in the RMSE values as the number of samples in the model increases. Of interest when we look at this, when this data is compared with the DWI data, there is a clearly different plateau for the RMSE data. So recall for the DWI, those values were of the order of 1 to 2. With this process data, we are talking about RMSEs of the order of 17 to 18, and so on. So we attribute this to the underlying uncertainty in the measurement, and this recovery data has a much higher intrinsic uncertainty than the DWI test data. So let me just summarise the journey that we've just been on. So a well-designed metallurgical sampling program start with clarity about the objectives of the test work. So what we can do is apply the geometallurgical principles to the sample selection, ensuring that we've got maximum leverage from the metallurgical test work. So our data science and machine learning tools used for the assessment of the multivariate data aid interpretation of the relationships and avoid the limitations of univariate and bivariate statistical methods. So I've outlined an approach to demonstrating the impact of increasing sample numbers on the accuracy of two predictive model algorithms, linear regression and cubist, and the way that they can be tested using conventional RMSE statistics. So for the target variables tested, drop weight index, both models clearly show a minimum number of samples beyond which the addition of further samples make little or no improvement to the error in the models. The RMSE, as expected, declines more or less asymptotically to the total error associated with factors including the geological sample heterogeneity, the experimental error, and the error associated with all characteristics that aren't actually captured in the input data. And it is important to understand that much as we have the ability to use multiple variables as input, it is a challenge to use them all, and selecting the appropriate variables is another part that I haven't really touched on at all, but that is an important component of the way this approach works. So hopefully what I've demonstrated here is that some geometallurgical principles and some data science tools that are used for metallurgical sampling and test data analysis provides us really a measurable and repeatable basis for sample selection. It is driven by the geological characteristics of the mineralisation, provides an alternative to the plethora of rules of thumb sampling procedures that really have limited connection to geological variability nor the variability of the metallurgical responses. So thank you very much for your attention. And just one note as I finalise, if any of you attended IMPC or the Middle Operators Conference last year, you would have seen much of this. It is familiar. And the actual source paper for this has been published under both of those congresses, if you want to see a full version. I have included some additional examples in this presentation, though, because things have evolved over the last year or so. But thank you very much.
Any question?
Thanks, Paul. That was really interesting. Tom Evans here from the BRC. Just quick question. Drilling data that goes into your UMAP analysis, like drilling data is always spatially clustered to some degree, sometimes to a very high degree. Do you need to decluster that data from a spatial perspective before you run those analyses to prevent sample bias, or do you just run it on mass and it doesn't really matter?
No, we don't. We don't decluster. So because we have the spatial information, then each sample is well described from that perspective.
And Nick Cook here, following up from Tom. So a couple of parts of this question. What normalization method do you use for the data before you go into UMAP? And what's your feeling about UMAP versus TSNE, for example, as a method?
Okay. Okay, so whoops, what's going on? Let's move away. Okay. All right, so let me answer the second one first. We use UMAP because our view is it generally preserves the global and local relationships in a better manner to TSNE. That doesn't mean you cannot use it for this purposes, but that is what we have chosen to do. Now, there is a normalization routine we do use for the UMAP algorithm, but I can't tell you precisely what it is, and I wouldn't want to get it wrong. Question for our data scientist to answer that. So I do apologise, and if you want to follow up, I'm happy to describe it.
Paul, there are a few questions online. I'm perhaps going to read a few of them, and then you can see if you... The first question is asking, I understand this is not a focus of your presentation, but do you think there are characteristics that are not being measured but could affect geometallurgy, like physical or chemical properties or other kind of properties?
Well, there are always things that are not measured. So it's a difficult question this isn't so much a difficult question to answer. So obviously drill hole database sets, they are originally, the properties that are measured, etc., are designed by the exploration team or the geologists that are associated with that. There are a lot of common data sets, but there certainly are a lot of measurements that could be made on drill core as part of the logging process. That would potentially add to our knowledge. One that we note is difficult to ascertain or describe is texture, particularly in a gold situation, and particle size, sample by sample particle size distributions, for example. They severely affect. They affect the processing response. The heterogeneity of the ore body is another characteristic, and in general, it's not a direct measurement. So there are a number of things that certainly could add to it. One of my views and recommendations is that when we're building or designing geometallurgical programs, it's really important that there is a conversation and an agreement that is held between the geologists and the metallurgists and mining engineers and so on about what it is that you can usefully achieve and what you want to achieve with developing one of these programs. And what that allows you to do is to say, there are opportunities to measure a lot of additional parameters or properties of the ore body while you're handling the drill core. Because once it's in the drill hole database, then it's been captured. And it is, it's both the most extensive and at that point probably the cheapest sets of measurements that you can do.
Well, thank you. There's another one asking, how much operations experience does your team have? Does this only work on laptop? And do you have any? What do you think miners and operators would take this? How do you think the miners and operators would take this?
Everything I've shown is a real example. But I mean, if you're talking about what is the acceptance in the industry, then I would argue it's growing. There is a recognition, an increasing recognition that there is that data is radically underused in most instances. And I think we've done in excess of 20 plus projects in this area, but increasingly, we are seeing commentary from our clients, from industry in general, that says, well, we recognise the importance of geometallurgy. The gap is still an understanding of how you need to go about it and what the tools available actually are, to do coherent things. As a metallurgist, for decades we talked about geometallurgy, but in a general sense, what we have done is develop rather simplistic relationships that really don't explore the possibility of the depth of data in the drill hole database.
What considerations do you have when building the synthetic data?
Okay, so, well, that synthetic data, the critical consideration there is that the expanded data set has to have the same distribution of statistical properties as the source data. So that's why we use that the calcium process model approach, because it preserves those statistics within the expanded data set. And we demonstrated that with the cumulative distribution function for both the expanded data set and the original data set.
Are there any more questions here, or should I keep going? Okay. Now, Daniel Lay is asking for slide 17. How do you decide where the additional samples should be taken? And what's the mathematical or modeling reasoning behind it?
Well, so fundamentally what the UMAP does is project every data point within the data set. So for every point there is a sample. So what it does is what it does is allow us to identify areas where we, as I say, we have not selected metallurgical samples. Now, in terms of, I suppose, why would we add additional samples for any particular group? Well, again, this is where subject matter expertise comes in about understanding the characteristics, the underlying characteristics of those groups. That would be an influence on whether or not, samples would be chosen. In a general sense, we need sufficient samples to enable us to build or to create predictive geometallurgical model. Given the way in which those models are built, we would prefer to have sample coverage across all of those identified groups in a more even manner. That is not necessarily in proportion to perhaps the volume, the volume representation of those groups within the ore body. That's a mathematical input or requirement of the model, if you like, or it's the best way to build those models. Ultimately, if you're then want to look at how that sort of is calculated, projects out in real space, then obviously you take into consideration, the volume, the volume that particular geometallurgical grouping represents. But that is a consequence of what we've been doing. I suppose in that sense there isn't a strong mathematical reasoning behind that additional selection. It's a combination of factors.
We have time for one more. There's quite a lot online, so perhaps forward them to you later. But there's one from Tim Napierman. Tim says, "Nice to see you again, Paul. UMAP looks a bit like principal component and K-means grouping. Looks a bit like K-means clustering.
Yeah.
Is that correct? And or are they related?"
Okay, so hi Tim. It is true. The principal component analysis is something that has been used a lot. It has similarities from the perspective that the UMAP generates coordinate pairs which are representative of the multivariate characteristics, which you can then plot. Principal component analysis uses the underlying algorithm, identifies the major, there's the principal components, and where it then plots typically 1 and 2 with respect to that representation. Ultimately, they do generate things that look similar, but from a different underlying algorithm. The UMAP process is in mathematical terms, is a topological analysis. The K-means grouping, I think, Tim, that they're just two names for the same thing, the same general approach. But I can clarify that if you like.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul. I think that's all we have for today. Thank you once again. Shall we give it up to Paul?
Thank you very much.
We hope to see you all once again next week. We have Robert McLaughlin from Metcom Technologies talk to us about the importance of the functional performance equation for milling circuits, particularly for metallurgists, but geologists are also invited to come. Thank you.